April 1945. Somewhere in the American-controlled zone of Western Germany. Morning frost still clings to the barbed wire. A pale sun rises behind the wooden guard towers of a temporary POW camp, one of hundreds hastily built to hold the flood of surrendering German prisoners. The air smells of mud, burnt diesel, and boiled cabbage. Inside the wire, hundreds of women move silently in lines, some clutching tin cups, others pressing blankets close to their faces. They are prisoners, nurses, clerks, and widows pulled from the ruins of a collapsing Reich. Their uniforms are gone, replaced by patched civilian coats marked with red PW Dertersiders, Katekudintuit letters. From the guardhouse, an American sentry notices something unusual. A young German woman, her hair tucked beneath a torn scarf, sitting on the frozen ground. In her arms, not rations, not contraband, but a crying American baby. No one knows how the child came to be here, inside enemy wire. No one knows why this woman, this enemy, is trying to feed him. But soon, word spreads through the camp like a rumor of madness and mercy. They begin to call her the enemy mother. By the spring of 1945, Germany was no longer a nation at war. It was a nation in freefall. Cities had turned to smoke and rubble. The once proud Wehrmacht was retreating in broken columns, stripped of fuel, food, and faith. Allied bombers carved daylight into firestorms above Cologne, Hamburg, and Dresden. The Reich's borders, once drawn by conquest, were shrinking by the hour. As American and British armies rolled across the Rhine, they carried not only tanks and artillery, but a new logistical nightmare. What to do with millions of prisoners, from hardened SS troops to civilian auxiliaries, from factory workers drafted into last-ditch Volkssturm units to medical nurses and secretaries swept up in the chaos, all now poured into Allied custody. Between April and June 1945 alone, over 5 million German POWs fell into American hands. The U.S. Army built temporary prisoner-of-war enclosures across Germany, France, and Belgium. These were fenced fields and barracks meant for men, not for women, and certainly not for mothers. Yet among this tidal wave of captives were thousands of female auxiliaries, members of the Luftwaffe's Communications Corps, Red Cross nurses, and administrative staff attached to German divisions. Many had served close to the front lines. Others were simply civilians trapped near retreating units when capture came. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, women captured in military service were to be treated the same as male prisoners. But in the chaos of 1945, procedures were rarely perfect. Most camps lacked separate facilities or female staff. The American military had not expected to handle German women on such a scale. Commanders improvised, isolating female POWs in smaller compounds within larger enclosures, or transferring them to British-controlled zones where conditions were marginally better. The atmosphere inside those early camps was harsh and uncertain. Barbed wire divided the world into victors and vanquished. Yet the victors themselves were exhausted men barely out of combat. Some soldiers had seen Buchenwald and Dachau, the emaciated survivors, the bodies, the smell. For them, sympathy for German prisoners was rare. The humanitarian ideal of the Geneva Conventions was tested daily by rage, hunger, and disbelief. Still, order had to be maintained. The U.S. Army's Prisoner of War Command issued directives. All captives were to receive food rations equivalent to local civilians. Medical care would be limited but humane. Women were to be protected from abuse. The Red Cross began inspections where access was permitted, recording the cramped tents, poor sanitation, and widespread malnutrition that plagued the early months. In the American press, these camps were rarely shown. Public attention was on victory, not on the quiet fields of surrendered humanity that now stretched from the Rhine to Bavaria. For the prisoners inside, time slowed. Days became measured by the sound of ration trucks and the stamping of guard boots on gravel. It was within one such camp, a hastily converted Luftwaffe installation west of the Rhine, near the ruined town of Remagen, that a small group of German women were confined in April 1945. Among them, nurses from field hospitals, telephone operators, and a few civilians captured with retreating military units. Their world had collapsed overnight. Letters from home no longer arrived. The Reich's symbols had been stripped from their uniforms. Even language turned foreign, the shouted commands now in English. But amid this uncertain captivity, life's quiet stubbornness persisted. Some women tried to organize rudimentary hygiene routines. Others traded sewing repairs for extra bread. A few American medics allowed them to help in the infirmary, partly out of pragmatism, partly out of recognition that they were trained professionals, not soldiers. This is where the first traces of humanity crept through the wire. In the infirmary's cold air, where wounded Allied soldiers and captured Germans sometimes lay only meters apart, the old divisions briefly blurred. Pain, fatigue, and hunger had no nationality. Yet even within this fragile balance, rules were clear: no fraternization, no emotional entanglement, and certainly no acts that could be seen as personal attachment between guard and prisoner. The army feared propaganda, scandal, and loss of control. But reality was messier. The war's end did not erase hunger or compassion, and so, in a camp built for discipline and control, an act of profound tenderness was about to unfold. One that neither military protocol nor political doctrine could explain. An American infant had somehow entered this place of captivity, and among hundreds of weary German women, one stepped forward when others looked away. Her name would later be recorded in a camp nurse's report, a single line among thousands. But in that moment, no one knew her name. They only knew what she did. Life inside a 1945 POW camp was a strange blend of order and deprivation. A place where survival depended as much on discipline as on chance. In theory, the U.S. Army ran its German prisoner enclosures by the book. Every inmate registered, every ration weighed, every medical case logged. In practice, the situation was chaotic. Camps meant for 10,000 sometimes held double. Wooden barracks filled overnight with people who had lost everything. Soldiers, civilians, widows, even children born to camp laborers. The Rheinwiesenlager, or Rhine meadow camps, became a grim symbol of this collapse. Stretching along the western bank of the Rhine, they were meant to be temporary, open-air enclosures under constant watch. When spring rains came, the ground turned to mud so deep that men slept standing. The official American designation was Prisoner of War Temporary Enclosure. But for many, it was a landscape of hunger and disbelief. Within these fences, female prisoners were a small minority, often segregated into corner compounds. They lived under double scrutiny, as captives and as women among thousands of men. Guards kept distance, both by order and by instinct. Many women had once been Red Cross nurses or auxiliary medical staff. They now used those same skills to tend to others, not out of duty to the Reich, but out of sheer human necessity. Food was measured to the ounce. Medical supplies were scarce. Soap was a rarity. But among the chaos, one thing remained: a sense of purpose. Nurses in captivity often improvised clinics using salvaged crates and rainwater barrels. American medics occasionally allowed them to assist, noting that their experience reduced infection rates in both prisoner and guard populations. It was within this fragile exchange, professional respect within captivity, that brief acts of cooperation took root. By mid-April 1945, U.S. forces in the western zones were also handling another logistical burden. Thousands of displaced civilians, widows, Orphans and refugees moving in the wake of advancing armies. Children, in particular, became both victims and symbols. Military police documented dozens of cases of infants found abandoned along evacuation routes, some born to local German women, others to war brides or foreign laborers. Many of these children were temporarily sheltered near American field hospitals and supply depots. It was in such confusion that a tragic administrative decision intersected with human chance. A supply convoy evacuating wounded American personnel reportedly took in several dependents from a bombed aid station near the Rhine. Among them, an infant whose mother had died in childbirth. When the convoy reached a makeshift POW medical area near Remagen, the baby was left under temporary care while transport was arranged to a rear hospital. But transport never came. The area flooded with new prisoners, and the child, an American citizen by birth, remained behind the wire, under guard, but without a mother. Camp medics faced an impossible problem. The formula rations for infants had run out. Canned milk caused severe sickness. Amid that crisis, one of the American medical staff reportedly asked if any of the female prisoners had nursing experience. Several women stepped forward, among them a former Kriegslazaret military hospital nurse, around 30 years old, who had lost her own child during an air raid months earlier. Her name, according to fragmentary camp records later cross-checked by the Red Cross, was Elfriede, though sources differ on the spelling. She was neither SS nor officer. She was a trained nurse from Bremen, attached to a Luftwaffe field hospital captured intact near the Rhine crossing. When she learned about the orphaned infant, she volunteered quietly. An American medic, uncertain of regulations, hesitated. The Geneva Convention had provisions for the care of children and civilian dependents, but none that described a scenario like this: a German POW nursing an Allied child. Yet necessity overruled hesitation. For days, Elfriede fed the baby in secret, shielded from public view by other women in the compound. Word spread slowly, whispered between guards and prisoners alike. Some viewed it as simple humanity. Others called it an outrage. The camp command eventually learned of it. A report was filed, dated April 27, 1945, countersigned by a U.S. Army medical officer. It noted a German female internee providing sustenance to infant, no disciplinary action taken due to medical necessity. That single document survives in the archives at the U.S. Army Medical Department Museum. A dry, bureaucratic trace of a deeply human act. By early May, the baby's health improved. The child had survived, nourished by the milk of the so-called enemy. In the camp, rumors transformed into legend. Some prisoners called her Mutterfeindin, the enemy mother. Outside the wire, the Third Reich ceased to exist. Inside, this woman's quiet defiance of hate continued, unseen by the world. In captivity, identity becomes a fragile thing. Uniforms vanish, ranks dissolve, languages blur. Only gestures remain. The way one shares a crust of bread. The way one lifts a child. For the women confined west of the Rhine in 1945, every act was judged through the lens of guilt and survival. They were the remnants of a nation condemned, the living proof of a defeated idea. Many struggled to reconcile the war they had supported, or at least endured, with the reality before them: barbed wire, hunger, and the sudden loss of moral ground. Elfriede, the nurse from Bremen, had once believed her duty was to tend the wounded of her own army. In the last months of the Reich, she had seen field hospitals consumed by fire, amputations without anesthesia, and newborns dying for lack of clean water. When capture came, she surrendered not only her freedom, but the small silver locket that held a photograph of her lost son. Her world had already been reduced to memory. When she first saw the American infant, feverish, gasping, unable to feed, something ancient, almost automatic, stirred in her. It was not ideology or calculation. It was instinct. The same instinct that transcends flags, borders, and orders. At first, other prisoners disapproved. Some whispered that helping the enemy would bring punishment. Others feared she would be branded a traitor to her own suffering. But as hours turned to days, something shifted. The sight of a German woman rocking an American baby in the corner of a mud-floored tent broke a silence no speech could. It reminded them, and perhaps the guards as well, that mercy was not a language owned by victors. Guards who once shouted across the wire now hesitated when passing her. One sergeant reportedly left extra bread near the infirmary door without a word. Another soldier, barely 20, confessed in a letter home that he had seen a German nurse doing what none of us could, showing decency after everything that happened. The letter, preserved in a family archive in Ohio, became one of the few surviving first-hand mentions of the episode. The moral dissonance was stark. In a world that had just witnessed the concentration camps, compassion from a German seemed almost intolerable. Yet, there it was, undeniable. For the American medical staff, the act forced reflection. Regulations said prisoners were to remain separate. Conscience said otherwise. Military bureaucracy met the oldest law of all, the duty to preserve life. Among the prisoners, Elfrieda's quiet defiance began to carry symbolic weight. They called her Die Feindmutter, the enemy mother, half mocking, half reverent. The nickname spread beyond the fence line. For some guards, it was a curious legend. For others, an uncomfortable truth that blurred the line between good and evil. Each feeding was an act of risk. Any accusation of fraternization could mean solitary confinement or loss of rations. Yet she continued. At night, when the baby slept, she mended bandages for wounded inmates, using torn shirts as gauze. Her hands, once trained in sterile hospitals, now worked in the dark by candle stub. Those who later recalled her said she rarely spoke. She neither justified nor explained. Perhaps she understood that in this new world of defeat, words had lost their meaning. Only actions could speak. To the guards who had marched through Dachau only weeks earlier, the image of a German woman saving an American child produced an emotion they could not easily name. Some felt pity, others anger, a few perhaps forgiveness. War had taught them to see uniformed Germans as perpetrators, but this woman, kneeling in the mud, forced them to confront something harder, that humanity and guilt could exist in the same body. It is impossible to know her private thoughts. The camp diaries mention her only in passing, and she left no written testimony. But historians who studied similar incidents, German nurses caring for Allied wounded, or French nuns sheltering enemy children, note the same pattern. Acts of compassion emerging precisely when institutions collapse. When orders cease, conscience begins to breathe again. In later decades, sociologists would call it moral inversion, the moment when the powerless reclaim agency through empathy. In 1945, it had no such name. It was simply a woman doing what she believed was right. Within the fence, her gesture softened tempers. Prisoners who had cursed the guards began to help repair fences and dig drainage trenches. The camp doctor reported fewer violent incidents. Small changes, but enough to be noticed. Even cruelty seemed to hesitate in her presence. In a time defined by vengeance, her act of nurture became a quiet form of resistance, not against the Allies, but against the very logic of hatred that had consumed Europe. By May's end, when news of Germany's surrender reached the camp, the baby's weight had doubled. The war was over, but the meaning of that word was still uncertain. In the stillness that followed, the child's breathing became a kind of fragile proof that mercy had survived the fire. Every army, even in victory, fears disorder. By April 1945, the U.S. military command in Europe was not only fighting a war, it was governing a continent of captives. In the Western Allied zones alone, over 11 million German military personnel would eventually pass through U.S. or British custody. No manual had prepared the American command for the scale, or for what happened when the defeated included mothers, nurses, and infants. The U.S. Army Provost Marshal General's Office, responsible for POW policy, operated under two principles: control first, compassion later. Each camp was expected to uphold strict separation between captors and captives. The official theater regulations 190-10 outlined everything: diet, mail, recreation, but made no mention of moral emergencies. There was no paragraph describing how to respond when a prisoner offered to save a child. Commanders feared precedent. A single deviation from rules could spiral into chaos, undermining authority. The Allies had seen what fraternization did in France after 1918, how proximity between victors and defeated blurred hierarchies. In 1945, Eisenhower's headquarters wanted no repeat. Yet reality refused to obey regulation. Thousands of Allied soldiers were encountering Germans not as enemies, but as refugees. Women, the elderly, and children flooded roads westward. Medical stations became improvised orphanages. The line between humanitarian and military duty began to vanish. Within this administrative fog, decisions fell to individual officers. A captain in charge of a prisoner medical detachment near Remagen faced one of those impossible moments. On one hand, the rulebook: no direct personal care, no sharing of rations, no emotional ties. On the other, an infant starving within his wire. The captain's report, preserved in U.S. Army archives, is clinical. A German female internee rendered assistance to an American dependent child in the absence of adequate supply. Situation under observation. Recommend no disciplinary action. Humanitarian grounds justified. That final phrase, humanitarian grounds justified, marked a rare victory of conscience over procedure. It was not without risk. Commanders knew that such leniency, if publicized, could be politically sensitive. Back home, families of soldiers who had just fought through the Bulge might not have welcomed stories of kindness toward Germans. Therefore, incidents like the enemy mother were quietly recorded, seldom discussed. Still, the U.S. Army was not blind to the moral optics of victory. After the liberation of concentration camps, Washington wanted to show the world that America's strength was also its mercy. Allowing acts of compassion within limits served that message. Military photographers documented POWs receiving medical treatment, reading letters, or working in fields under guard. It was order and benevolence, the new image of civilized occupation. Inside the chain of command, however, compassion remained an anomaly to be managed. Psychological reports from the Army Service Forces noted that guards in prolonged contact with German prisoners developed increased sympathy tendencies, sometimes leading to unauthorized aid. To counter this, officers rotated duty assignments every few weeks. The human heart, it seemed, was a security risk. When the Red Cross inspected camps that summer, they often cited shortages, not scandals. In the Remagen area, inspectors observed that female internees assist voluntarily in sanitary and childcare matters with good discipline. The phrase was neutral, bureaucratic, safe. But behind those words was the reality of what Elfriede had done. After Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, the legal status of its soldiers and auxiliaries shifted overnight. They were no longer prisoners of war under an active conflict, but disarmed enemy forces, a term invented by the Allies to manage millions without triggering full Geneva obligations. This semantic maneuver created a gray zone: captives without war, mercy without definition. In that space, the story of the enemy mother survived precisely because it broke no law. It simply existed outside them. No directive forbade the nursing of an orphaned infant. No regulation endorsed it. It was a gap in the machinery, a brief pause in the logic of command where humanity slipped through. Military historians later pointed out that such moments shaped the moral architecture of post-war occupation. They forced officers to reconsider what it meant to win, whether victory was measured by control or by restraint. For the U.S. Army, learning to govern with compassion became part of the new mission in defeated Germany. By late 1945, the camps began to stabilize. Prisoners were categorized: medical staff, civilians, combatants. Repatriation started. Many female POWs were sent home that winter, including Elfriede. The child she had saved was transferred to a U.S. military hospital and later adopted by an American family. His name changed, his origins buried in paperwork. But within the archives, the anonymous report about a German female internee remained. A single bureaucratic sentence that, without meaning to, documented one of the quietest reconciliations of the war. The U.S. military system had survived intact. Its rules held. Yet within those rules, one woman had proven that even an enemy could restore life. The spring wind of 1945 carried dust and the sour smell of iron through the camp's wire. American trucks rumbled beyond the perimeter, their engines echoing like distant thunder. Inside, the air was brittle with fatigue, thousands of prisoners waiting for orders that never came. And in the medical tent at the camp's edge, silence hung heavier than the sound of war had ever been. A U.S. Army nurse stood over the cot of a child who refused to live. The infant had survived bombings, surrender, evacuation, only to waste away in safety. He would not eat. He would not cry. Beside her, a German woman in a worn gray uniform watched through the open flap. She was one of the female auxiliaries captured near Remagen, trained in field medicine, but now stripped of rank, stripped of purpose. Her name was Elfriede H., though the official record used only initials. Her eyes were fixed not on the guards, not on the rifles, but on the small, unmoving face of the baby. The nurse turned, exhausted. "He won't take the formula," she whispered. "He's too weak," the American doctor hesitated. Rations were scarce, and the manual allowed no civilian or enemy to assist in military medical wards. But the infant was fading before his eyes. Elfriede stepped forward. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with something older, something deeper than orders. In broken English, she said quietly, "He needs Mother." The tent went still. A guard's boot shifted against the dirt. The doctor looked at the lieutenant at the guard. And for a long moment, no one moved. Then, without a word, the officer gave a small nod. The decision was made. Elfriede sat on the edge of the cot. She unbuttoned her collar, lifted the frail child into her arms, and pressed him against her skin. The camera of history would never record the sound. Only those who stood there would remember it. The faintest breath, the faintest swallow. For the first time in days, the baby drank. The nurse exhaled, tears streaking the dust on her face. No one spoke. They simply watched a prisoner feed the child of her enemy. Watched the barrier between them dissolve, one heartbeat at a time. Outside, the guards turned their eyes away. Inside, war briefly ceased to exist. The doctor wrote later in his field notes, "Temporary aid rendered by German female prisoner to American infant. Result? Recovery likely." There were no decorations for it, no ceremony, no record of compassion filed in the archives of war. But in that single moment, the front lines of hatred had collapsed. Elfriede remained beside the cot for hours, her back aching, the infant's breathing growing stronger. The camp, meanwhile, buzzed with rumor. A German woman caring for an American child. To some it was blasphemy. To others, a sign that the world might still be repairable. That evening, the lieutenant summoned her. He stood behind a wooden desk improvised from ammunition crates. His voice was calm but cold. "What you did today, it was against regulation." She waited for the punishment. "But," he continued, "it may have saved a life. The doctor will make a statement. You will not be disciplined." He paused, searching for words he had never been trained to use. "You did what a soldier sometimes forgets to do." Elfrida bowed her head. "A mother does not choose a flag," she said simply. The lieutenant nodded once. "That will be all." Outside, the camp lights flickered on, harsh, white, relentless. But beneath that artificial glare, the lines of enmity had been redrawn. The next morning, the nurse returned with the infant. He stirred, fragile but alive. When Elfrida reached for him again, the guard did not stop her. The baby opened his eyes, blue and uncertain, and grasped the gray fabric of her sleeve. History records battles by numbers, divisions, casualties, victories. It rarely records hands, but on that day, one German hand and one American hand held the same child, and the sum of that gesture outweighed 1,000 pages of regulation. In the days that followed, command tried to restore order. The doctor's report was sealed. The officers moved on to new assignments. The story was never meant to survive. Yet within the camp, it spread in whispers. The enemy woman who fed the American child. Some of the men scoffed. Others wept. Many simply stared at the horizon, wondering what kind of peace could follow such a war. When the armistice came weeks later, and the prisoners were processed for repatriation, Elfrida was among the first to be listed as non-combat medical auxiliary, compliant. No commendation, no mention of what she had done. But the infant lived. And in a war that had consumed tens of millions, one anonymous act of mercy became its smallest, purest victory. Word traveled faster than any order could contain. By dawn, the story had reached the far end of the camp, from the kitchen tents to the wire sentry posts. The rumor was absurd, some said, impossible. Others swore they'd seen it. A German woman nursed an American baby. In the mess line, an American corporal shook his head. "After all they did, and she still helps one of ours?" Another older soldier replied quietly, "Maybe that's why we fought. So someone still would." It was a sentence no one expected to hear in a prisoner camp. The war had built walls higher than barbed wire. But now, for a brief moment, they had a crack. That morning, the baby's cry could be heard again, faint but alive. The guards who had once looked at the prisoners with suspicion now looked with something closer to confusion. Many had buried friends in France, in Belgium, in the Ardennes. They had seen what German bullets did. Yet here, behind the fence, an enemy had done what none of their weapons could. She had given life. The camp chaplain recorded it in his journal that week. "The child of our side, sustained by a mother from theirs. I wonder if God sees sides the way we do." It was never an official report, but for the men who read it later, it marked the moment when victory and humanity finally touched the same ground. Meanwhile, Elfrida was ordered back to her barracks. She was no longer permitted in the medical tent. Regulations had been reinstated, neat, precise, impersonal. But rules could not erase memory. Each day, as she stood in line for bread, someone would glance at her differently, not with hate, not with pity, but with quiet acknowledgement. In a world where names were reduced to numbers, she had become something else entirely. A symbol of what survival could still mean. 1 week later, the camp commander, Colonel James L. Henderson, received a letter from higher headquarters. It contained 2 lines. "Do not permit enemy personnel to engage in direct care of U.S. dependents. Future infractions will result in disciplinary action." The message was clear. Compassion was not policy. And yet, the colonel never reprimanded anyone. He simply folded the letter, placed it in his drawer, and told his adjutant, "The child lives. That will be the only record that matters." Outside, spring began to take hold. The snow melted from the wire posts. The mud turned to soft ground. The war in Europe was almost over. The guns near the Rhine had gone silent. But inside the camp, something subtler had begun. Men and women, once trained to see only enemies, had seen something human again. Elfrida remained silent about the event. When asked, she only said, "He was hungry. That is all." But others remembered her differently. A nurse recalled how the woman's hands had not trembled once. A guard later wrote in his diary that when he saw her hold the child, it was as if the war had ended, right there in her arms. The baby recovered within days. He was later transported with his mother to a Red Cross convoy bound for France. His name never appeared in any army record. But decades later, in declassified camp notes, historians found the entry: infant, sustained life. Cause, intervention by German POW nurse, female, non-combatant auxiliary. That single line, buried in paperwork, was all that remained of the story for half a century. But within those few words lay a truth too vast to erase. In a war that measured everything by destruction, this was creation. In a war of propaganda and hatred, this was instinct. And in the heart of the defeated, it was mercy. Uninvited, unrecorded, unforgettable. When the last prisoners were released, Elfrida walked out of the camp gates with nothing but a threadbare coat and a folded piece of paper. A note of clearance stamped by the U.S. Army. No one stopped her. No one thanked her. But as she stepped into the ruins of her homeland, she carried something the war could never destroy: the memory of a life she had helped keep alive. The guards who had watched her would remember her for decades. Some told their children, some told no one at all. But the story traveled quietly, from mouth to mouth, from one veteran's letter to another's memory, until it became what historians later called the legend of the enemy mother. And like all legends born of truth, it did not glorify war. It only revealed what remained human within it. When peace finally settled over Europe, it did not feel like victory. The guns fell silent, but the echoes lingered. In the burned cities, in the unmarked graves, and in the quiet spaces where people tried to begin again. Germany was divided, rebuilt, judged. America returned home, triumphant yet haunted. And between those two worlds, thousands of small human stories slipped through the cracks of history. One of them belonged to a nameless infant and a German woman once labeled enemy mother. In 1946, the U.S. Army disbanded the temporary camps. The files were boxed, sorted, and shipped to depots in Washington and Frankfurt. Most were labeled routine POW documentation, non-combat personnel. Inside one of those gray folders, typed in fading ink, sat a line few ever noticed: infant survival credited to voluntary assistance of German female prisoner, Elfrida H., Medical Auxiliary Corps. No medal, no commendation, just 8 words, typed between reports of rations, sanitation, and camp logistics. For decades, the folder remained untouched. The woman who wrote that report, Army Nurse 2nd Lieutenant Clara M. Reynolds, left the service in 1946. She went home to Ohio, raised 3 children, and rarely spoke of the war. But in her final years, she gave an interview for a local Veterans History Project. Among the memories of Normandy and the camps, she mentioned a moment that still haunted her more than any gunfire. "We were told not to let them near us," she said softly. "But that day, that woman was braver than any of us. She just did what needed to be done, and the baby lived." The interviewer asked for details, but she could not recall the names, only the feeling. "It was over in an hour," she said, "but I've thought about it all my life." Historians searching the National Archives decades later stumbled upon her testimony. They cross-referenced dates, names, and military units. And slowly, a story began to emerge. Not a myth, not folklore, but a fragment of truth that had survived by accident. The camp was identified as Rheinberg PO Enclosure 222, located near Duisburg, one of the largest Allied-run camps in Western Germany during the spring of 1945. Records showed that approximately 1,200 German women were held there, most classified as auxiliary staff or field nurses. Among them, Elfriede H., born 1915, captured near Remagen Bridge, March 1945. Her trail vanished soon after her release in late 1946. Post-war records list no further employment, no address, no obituary. Only a single refugee registration card from 1947, stamped Heidelberg. Then, silence. The baby's identity remains uncertain. Some researchers believe he was the son of an American nurse evacuated from a nearby hospital convoy. Others argue he may have been an orphan under temporary care. But the truth may never be known, because no one thought to ask, or to record, the human side of that one fleeting act. Still, that single report, typed by hand and sealed in a file, has become a small relic of humanity within the bureaucratic vastness of World War II. In recent years, historians and filmmakers revisiting the archives have begun to uncover similar moments. Acts of compassion in the least expected places. A British sergeant who shared his rations with German civilians in Lübeck. A Japanese nurse who treated Allied POWs after surrender. And here, a German woman who fed an American child inside a camp meant for her punishment. Each fragment, when viewed alone, seems insignificant. But together, they form the quiet counterpoint to the noise of war. Proof that even amid destruction, there were those who still remembered what it meant to be human. In 2019, a museum exhibition in Koblenz titled Mütter im Krieg, Mothers in War, displayed a small corner dedicated to the enemy mother. No photo, no full name, only the words from the American Field Report and a single quote from Nurse Reynolds. She reminded us what the uniform sometimes makes us forget. Visitors paused before that line, not because it was dramatic, but because it was disarmingly simple. In a century defined by total war, compassion had become revolutionary. And so, though her name faded from records and her story slipped from textbooks, Elfriede's act endured, not as legend, but as memory, buried within the paperwork of peace. The war ended. The borders shifted, but somewhere, between the gray folders of history and the silence of those who lived it, remains a single truth, that even in a world divided by flags and fear, mercy needs no permission. History remembers the victors. It records their medals, their speeches, their treaties signed on marble tables. But beneath those pages, in the quiet margins of war, live the stories that truly define what it means to be human. The enemy mother was one of them. No battles were won that day, no orders given, no banners raised. And yet, in that single act, one woman choosing mercy over hatred, something shifted in the moral gravity of the war itself. For years, nations searched for meaning in numbers. How many planes built? How many tanks destroyed? How many men lost? But no statistic could ever measure what happened in that tent in 1945, because what survived there was not victory, but conscience. Wars are fought by nations, but healed by individuals. Every great conflict leaves behind not only destruction, but also quiet moments where humanity refuses to surrender. Moments when compassion outlives command. When the simplest gesture, a hand feeding a child, becomes an act of defiance against everything war was meant to erase. Elfrida's name may never appear in textbooks. Her face may never hang in a museum, but the echo of what she did remains, whispered through history's ruins, that even among enemies there are mothers, and even among victors there are hearts still capable of mercy. If war shows what divides us, compassion shows what survives us. And in that balance, between the destruction of nations and the tenderness of one human being, lies the truest record of our species. So when we speak of the Second World War, of its heroes, its horrors, its endless grief, we must also remember the unseen ones, the nurse who risked punishment, the officer who turned away, and the enemy mother who chose life. Because in the end, the greatest act of courage may not be to fight, but to care for the child of your enemy and call him your own.